Here's something stupid I see on the internet at times. People poke fun at Sony for copying Nintendo all the time, the apparent kings of gaming innovation. And sure, plenty of things Nintendo did, Sony then also did afterwards. But in many cases, Nintendo aren't even the true innovators. They too are borrowing or even copying ideas by other companies and developers.
So in this video, I'm going to go through 15 things that Nintendo is often credited for inventing, when in fact,
they did no such thing. And you Nintendrones don't need to get all antsy because I'm not saying Nintendo is bad. For the most part, I'm just giving credit where credit is due.
So here are 15 things that show that Nintendo is no true innovator.
Exaggerating for the sake of a dramatic and clickbaity title, of course. They did do some innovations, just not these 15 that they often get credited for. Number 1, the freaking digital pad. The digital pad! You may have heard this story before. Nintendo's Gunpei Yokoi thought of the idea of having a digital button layout for controlling direction on a gaming device for the Game & Watch systems in 1982. This gets thrown around all over like false leaks on internet forums. Actually, exactly like that. Anyway, the digital direction pad was actually invented by Mattel in 1979 with the Intellivision system.
There was just one problem with it.
The original controller on this console was... Yeah, hang on, I'm fine. Nope. Okay, yeah. There is one good thing Nintendo did. They realized their audience was humans, and did the side layout thing with their controllers. If you open both of these controllers up, the insides are using the exact same technology. Meaning, while yes, Nintendo's design of the controller overall is much better, but they did not invent the technology involved in the digital pad, as they often are credited for. They just chopped some bits of plastic off of it. You'll find this to be a common theme in this video. Oftentimes, yes, Nintendo did take the thing and make it somewhat better and thus more popular, but they did not invent it. Number 2, the analog stick. Yep, the Nintendo's pride and joy of the Nintendo 64, the analog stick, was in fact not invented by them. This whole huge innovation that changed 3D gaming forever and was the sole reason the controller was designed for Hiroshima babies was not invented by Nintendo. In fact, analog stick technology dates all the way back to 1976, before the directional pad even. How do people screw this up? The Radofin 1292 APVS controller was the first to use analog stick technology, and I know that some of you sheeple are saying, No, Maxwell, the thumbstick! An analog stick you use with your thumb instead of your whole hand. Well, if you Nintendudes turn off your Star Fox and let go of your joysticks for 20 seconds, I can show you that the thumbstick was also invented way earlier. The XE1 AP controller in 1989 featured 2 analog thumbsticks. One just moves up and down, but the other is a full 360 degrees. Shame the controller was ugly though. Looks like Humpty Dumpty's demented cousin. Number 3, Duck Hunt was crazy amazing, right? With that sweet innovative light gun technology that was training future generations of school shooters according to news anchors? Yeah, crazy, huh? Crazy that Nintendo sometimes gets the credit for this technology, even though the Magnavox Odyssey, literally the very first video game console of all time, has the exact same technology. And with a much cooler gun. Number 4, shoulder buttons. Oh man. How come no other console makers thought of putting buttons on top for your fingers to press any time before Nintendo Super Nintendo? I'll tell you why. Because Mattel invented it in 1979, and they mostly went unused. Nintendo did bring shoulder buttons back at a good time, but they did not invent them in the slightest. Number 5, the Game Boy was actually not the first handheld game console. The big thing that separated the Game Boy from other handheld gaming devices at the time was that it was the first handheld game system to have interchangeable game cartridges. Before then, all you had were Game & Watch systems with 1 or 2 pre-built games. Except that's not true. Milton Bradley introduced the Microvision in 1979, a decade before the Game Boy, and it also had interchangeable game cards. The Game Boy only popularized the idea. Yes, well, you may be saying, in Nintendo's defense, they did invent handheld gaming with the Game & Watch systems a few months before the Microvision. Oh really? You really think that, do ya? Well, let me take you back in time to the 1950s. The Kragstand Periscope Firing Range. 2 D batteries and 1 game. Plot it down and play it anywhere. A physical backdrop rolls in the background, and when an enemy appears, you shoot it from your submarine. Simple, but so were the Game & Watches. And if you don't want to count this one because it's not an all-electronic game, there is still 1976's Auto Race by Mattel. The same Game & Watch technology 3 years before the Game & Watch. Again, Nintendo just popularized it. Number 6, motion controls. Yes, really. Remember when the Wii launched and ruined gaming, but people still thought it was the coolest for years for bringing motion controls to gaming? Well, the act of putting motion detectors in controllers actually dates back to 1981. Datasoft brought us Laystick. And yes, that's its actual name. No, it wasn't named by 2011 Redditors. Lay Stick was a lay joystick for lay Atari systems that you could place on any lay surface. It used motion control technology to tell which position it was in, the same way many different Wii games work. As for other forms of motion control, TV Golf and Batter Up also had swing detection in 1994. Arcade cabinets from the late 80s also had all sorts of motion controls, and 2000's Police 911 had full-body motion control. It also ruins the day of anyone emergency Googling the police's phone number. No, I don't need the game, I need help! Number 7. The Start button with pause functionality. The Famicom is often credited for this innovation, but it was actually the Atari 5200 that gave us the start and pause buttons. Even a reset button on the controller itself. Nintendo wouldn't even do that until the Wii. Number 8. Multitap. The NES Multitap allowed you to play 4-player games even though the NES only had 2 ports, and this was considered crazy at the time. For the first time, 4-player non-arcade games existed, except this had already been a thing for years with the PC Engine's Multitap. Number 9. Modem connectivity. No, I'm not going to pull a PC did it first this time, since modems on PCs have been a thing for as long as modems and the wheel have. But now I'm specifically talking a modem connected to your video game console. The Famicom is often credited as being the first console to do this, and Fire Emblem was one of the first downloadable games. But its modem was released in 1987, which is beaten thanks to this obscure bit of knowledge. The CVC game line in 1983 would connect your Atari 2600 to the internet, and you could download games from a selection of 80, and even upload your high scores. However, it didn't last very long and soon became extremely obscure because it was released just before the game crash of '83. Number 10. The touchscreen on the DS is also credited for bringing touch controls to gaming. And true, it brought it to the front of everyone's attention, but the Tiger Gamecom, or TigerGame.com, I don't know, was also a touchscreen handheld with touchscreen games too, and that was in 1997. Number 11. You know those DDR pads you buy in an attempt to turn gaming into exercise to start losing all of your surplus lard your hobby has gifted you? And when you get tired, you put them away in the closet never to be seen again? Yeah, those dusty old pads. Nintendo is often credited as inventing them with the NES's Power Pad, but that was in 1988, and Bandai made the family trainer for the Famicom in 1986. It was then further developed into Nintendo's pad, but Bandai invented it, not Nintendo. Number 12. First-party wireless controllers. Wireless controllers have been around for a very long time. Even the NES had them, but the thing was, only third parties, meaning other companies, would make these controllers. Like those awful tiny Mad Catz controllers you give to your guests to play with. The reason first parties, meaning the console makers, were weary of wireless is because at the time they were expensive, and console makers wanted to lower the cost of their system. But the GameCube's Wavebird wireless controllers made by Nintendo were amazing. Finally, first-party wireless controllers. The day is saved! Let's all collectively forget about the Atari CX42 wireless controllers from 1983. Yay! Number 13. Force feedback, also known as rumble. Thankfully, Nintoddlers aren't dumb enough to assume that the Switch's HD rumble is the first rumble ever, but many do assume that the Nintendo 64 brought it to the table. Not quite true. It was the Aura Interactor in 1994, a dumb vest that everybody hated that you would put on and it vibrated when you got punched in Mortal Kombat, and other games too. It was the first type of haptic feedback, or rumble, or force feedback on a console, and this technology had existed at arcades for a long time before that too. Nintendo was just the first to put it in a controller on a console. Good on them, I suppose, except no, they didn't even put it in a controller, they put it on a controller with a detachable accessory. Sony was the first to put it in a controller, albeit after the N64, but still. Number 14. The trigger button. This is the same story as the shoulder buttons, only this time instead of the Mattel and Television inventing them in '79, it was the Bally Professional Home Arcade System in 1978, a whole year before shoulder buttons existed, and 18 years before Nintendo stole the credit for it. But the same thing happened. The trigger button was made, and later it was decided that it wasn't the best for the time. So, later consoles didn't use it, and the Nintendo 64 brought it back at a good time, but didn't invent it. And number 15, saving the best for last, save functionality. I hear this one all the time. I'm sure you have too. The Legend of Zelda was the first game to allow you to save. Before Zelda, the only option was passwords. Well, as it turns out, that's not exactly true, but it depends on your definition of game. Zelda on the NES was in fact the first console game to do that, but Taito's Space Invaders saves your high score back in 1978, and the PC adventure game Zork 1 also let you save your progress in its story all the way back in 1981. So, good on Nintendo for bringing half a decade old technology to consoles, I guess. Though I suppose that's what console gaming is in general. It should be noted that PCs were an entirely different beast back then. You had your gaming PCs for gaming, like Ataris and the Commodore 64 or the Amiga, and then you had your PCs for work, like IBM units and Apple units. They all could do some of the other, but poorly. So most gaming PCs at the time were essentially fancy consoles. Fancy consoles that could save your game practically eons in technology time before The Legend of Zelda.
And actually, I have one more thing to add that I found out while editing. Let's go back to the Intellivision. There was a peripheral you could attach to it that gave it a keyboard and a cassette writer. And just like memory cards, you could use cassettes to save your games. And this was in 1981, before the Famicom even existed, and 5 years before Zelda. True, this peripheral was expensive, lacked support, was generally hated, had legal trouble, and was released a bit before the game crash, but it still had console game saving first.
So congratulations, now you know 15 things. 15 bits of obscure gaming history that show that while Nintendo brought technology back at the right time, or popularized a bit of technology, they did not invent it. And saying they did is giving credit to whom doesn't deserve it. And don't even get me started on gameplay and game engine innovations that Nintendo came up with, because even those are often untrue. Oh, what's that? You want me to go over those too? Well, too bad. Better subscribe and when I get around to it I'll tell you. Or you could always just research it yourself, you lazy flesh.
Innovator.
Exaggerating for the sake of a dramatic and clickbaity title, of course. They did do some innovations, just not these 15 that they often get credited for. Number 1, the freaking digital pad. The digital pad! You may have heard this story before. Nintendo's Gunpei Yokoi thought of the idea of having a digital button layout for controlling direction on a gaming device for the Game & Watch systems in 1982. This gets thrown up... Okay, yeah. There is one good thing Nintendo did. They realized their audience was humans, and did the side layout thing with their controllers. If you open both of these controllers up, the insides are using the exact same technology. Meaning, while yes, Nintendo's design of the controller... Here's something stupid I see on the internet at times. People poke fun at Sony for copying Nintendo all the time, the apparent kings of gaming innovation. And sure, plenty of things Nintendo did Sony then also did afterwards, but in many cases Nintendo aren't even the true innovators. They too are borrowing or even copying ideas by other companies and developers.
So in this video, I'm going to go through 15 things that Nintendo is often credited for inventing, when in fact,
they did no such thing. And you Nintendrones don't need to get all antsy because I'm not saying Nintendo is bad. For the most part, I'm just giving credit where credit is due.
So here are 15 things that show that Nintendo is no true
around all over like false leaks on internet forums. Actually, exactly like that. Anyway, the digital direction pad was actually invented by Mattel in 1979 with the Intellivision system.
There was just one problem with it.
The original controller on this console was... Yeah, hey God, I'm fine. Nope.